Hello, my amazing tribe. I'm excited to connect with you through this video. Hello, dear viewers. Get ready to expand your horizons as we delve into Al-Hallaj. Hallaj, Iran. Mansour Hallaj or Mansour Hallaj 26 March 922 Hijri 309 AH was a Persian Hanbali mystic, poet, and teacher of Sufism. He was best known for his saying, "I am the truth, annihilation," which many saw as a claim to divinity, while others interpreted it as an instance of annihilation of the ego, which allowed God to speak through him. Al-Hallaj gained a wide following as a preacher before he became implicated in power struggles of the Abbasid court and was executed after a long period of confinement on religious and political charges. Although most of his Sufi contemporaries disapproved of his actions, Hallaj later became a major figure in the Sufi tradition. Let's now turn our gaze towards early years and explore the fascinating connections it has to offer. Al-Hallaj was born around 858 in Pars province of the Abbasid Empire to a cotton carder. Hallaj means cotton carder in Arabic in an Arabized town called Al-Bay. His grandfather was a Zoroastrian magus. His father moved to a town in Wasit famous for its school of Quran reciters. Al-Hallaj memorized the Quran before he was 12 years old and would often retreat from worldly pursuits to join other mystics in study at the school of Sol al-Tustari. During this period, Al-Hallaj lost his ability to speak Persian and later wrote exclusively in Arabic. Al-Hallaj was a Sunni Muslim. When he was 20, Al-Hallaj moved to Basra, where he married and received his Sufi habit from Mak, although his lifelong and monogamous marriage later provoked opposition from the latter. Through his brother-in-law, Al-Hallaj found himself in contact with a Zaydi Shiite clan that supported the Zon rebellion. Al-Hallaj later went to Baghdad to consult the famous Sufi teacher Junaid of Baghdad, but he was tired of the conflict that existed between his father-in-law and Mak and set out on a pilgrimage to Mecca against the advice of Junaid. As soon as the Zon rebellion was crushed. Let's zoom in on pilgrimages and travels and understand its implications. In Mecca he made a vow to remain for 1 year in the courtyard of the sanctuary in fasting and total silence. When he returned from Mecca, he laid down the Sufi tunic and adopted a lay habit in order to be able to preach more freely. At that time a number of Sunnis, including former Christians who would later become viziers at the Abbasid court, became his disciples, but other Sufis were scandalized, while some Mu'tazilis and Shias who held high posts in the government accused him of deception and incited the mob against him. Al-Hallaj left for eastern Iran and remained there for 5 years, preaching in the Arab colonies and fortified monasteries that housed volunteer fighters in the jihad, after which he was able to return and install his family in Baghdad. Al-Hallaj made his second pilgrimage to Mecca with 400 disciples, where some Sufis, his former friends, accused him of sorcery and making a pact with the jinn. Afterwards he set out on a long voyage that took him to India and Turkestan beyond the frontiers of Islamic lands. He returned to Mecca for his final pilgrimage clad in an Indian loincloth and a patched garment over his shoulders. There he prayed to God to be made despised and rejected, so that God alone might grant grace to himself through his servant's lips. With our curiosity piqued, let's embark on a dedicated exploration of imprisonment and execution and its fascinating intricacies. After returning to his family in Baghdad, Al-Hallaj began making proclamations that aroused popular emotion and caused anxiety among the educated classes. These included avowing his burning love of God and his desire to die accursed for the community, and statements such as, "O Muslims, save me from God, God has made my blood lawful to you, kill me." It was at that time that Al-Hallaj is said to have pronounced his famous shaf, "I am the truth." He was denounced at the court, but a Shafi's jurist refused to condemn him, stating that spiritual inspiration was beyond his jurisdiction. Al-Hallaj's preaching had by now inspired a movement for moral and political reform in Baghdad. Sunni reformers made an unsuccessful attempt to depose the underage Caliph al-Muqtada. When he was restored, his Shi's vizier unleashed anti-Hanbali repressions which prompted Al-Hallaj to flee Baghdad, but 3 years later he was arrested, brought back, and put in prison, where he remained for 9 years. The conditions of Al-Hallaj's confinement varied depending on the relative sway his opponents and supporters held at the court, but he was finally condemned to death in 922 on the charge of being a Carmatian rebel who wished to destroy the Kaaba, because he had said the important thing is to proceed 7 times around the Kaaba of one's heart. According to another report, the pretext was his recommendation to build local replicas of the Kaaba for those who are unable to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. The Queen Mother interceded with the Caliph, who initially revoked the execution order, but the intrigues of the Vizier finally moved him to approve it. On 23 Elster March 25, trumpets announced his execution the next day. The words he spoke during the last night in his cell are collected in Akbar Al-Hallaj. Thousands of people witnessed his execution on the banks of the Tigris River. He was first punched in the face by his executioner, then lashed until unconscious, and then decapitated or hanged. Witnesses reported that Al-Hallaj's last words under torture were, "All that matters for the ecstatic is that the unique should reduce him to unity," after which he recited the Quranic verse. His body was doused in oil and set alight, and his ashes were then scattered into the river. A cenotaph was quickly built on the site of his execution, and drew pilgrims from millennium until being swept away by a Tigris flood during the Urs. Some question whether Al-Hallaj was executed for religious reasons, as has been commonly assumed. According to Carl W. Ernst, the legal notion of blasphemy was not clearly defined in Islamic law, and statements of this kind were treated inconsistently by legal authorities. In practice, since apostasy was subsumed under the category of Zandik, viewing heresy as a political crime, they were prosecuted only when it was politically convenient. Sadiqat Qadri points out that it was far from conventional to punish heresy in the 10th century, and it is thought he would have been spared execution except that the Vizier of Caliph al-Muqtada wished to discredit certain figures who had associated themselves with Al-Hallaj. Previously, Al-Hallaj had been punished for talking about being at one with God by being shaved, pilloried and beaten with the flat of a sword, not executed because the Shafizite judge had ruled that his words were not proof of disbelief. Brace yourselves for the next chapter, where we'll be dissecting teachings and practices. Al-Hallaj addressed himself to popular audiences, encouraging them to find God inside their own souls, which earned him the title of the Qadr of Innermost Souls wa al-Isra. He preached without the traditional Sufi habit and used language familiar to the local Shiite population. This may have given the impression that he was a Carmatian missionary rather than a Sufi. His prayer to God to make him lost and despised can be regarded as typical for a Sufi seeking annihilation in God, although Louis Massinen has interpreted it as an expression of a desire to sacrifice himself as atonement on behalf of all Muslims. When Al-Hallaj returned to Baghdad from his last pilgrimage to Mecca, he built a model of the Kaaba in his home for private worship. Al-Hallaj was popularly credited with numerous supernatural acts. He was said to have lit 400 oil lamps in Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre with his finger, and extinguished an eternal flame in a Zoroastrian fire temple with the tug of a sleeve. Among other Sufis, Al-Hallaj was an anomaly. Many Sufi masters felt that it was inappropriate to share mysticism with the masses, yet Al-Hallaj openly did so in his writings and through his teachings. This was exacerbated by occasions when he would fall into trances which he attributed to being in the presence of God. Hallaj was also accused of Al-Incarnationism, the basis of which charge seemed to be a disputed verse in which the author proclaims mystical union in terms of two spirits in one body. This position was criticized for not affirming union and unity strongly enough. There are two spirits left, whereas the Sufi fanatics speak of utter annihilation and annihilation in annihilation, the annihilation of the consciousness of annihilation, with only one actor, the deity, left. Sir Al-Jaichi has argued that in speaking of the unity with the divine in terms of Al-Hallaj does not mean the fusion or mingling of the divine and human substances. Rather, he has in mind a heightened sense of awareness that culminates in the fulfillment of a spiritual supersensory vision of God's presence. Edward Said succinctly described Al-Hallaj as quasi-Christ-like. There are conflicting reports about his most famous Shay, an El-Yok I am the truth, which was taken to mean that he was claiming to be God, since Al-Yok the truth is one of the names of God in Islam. While meditating, he uttered the earliest report, coming from a hostile account of Bosra grammarians, states that he said it in the Mosque of Al-Mansur, while testimonies that emerged decades later claimed that it was said in private during consultations with Junaid Baghdadi. Even though this utterance has become inseparably associated with his execution in the popular imagination, owing in part to its inclusion in his biography by Attar of Nishapur, the historical issues surrounding his execution are far more complex. In another controversial statement, Al-Hallaj claimed there is nothing wrapped in my turban but God, and similarly he would point to his cloak and say, Mfjabatil el there is nothing in my cloak but God. He also wrote, in the 11th volume of the Proto-Salafi Ibn Kathar's book Al-Bidayah wa al-Nihaya, it is said that Al-Hallaj used to deceive people by putting on plays with his hired men under the guise of spiritual healing, and extorting money from them by cunning and secret, and it is also stated that he came to India to learn and practice Indian magic. Ibn Kathir also said in the book, Abu Abd al-Rahman al-Sulami Omar ibn Uthman said on the authority of al-Makki, he said, I was walking with Al-Hallaj in some streets of Mecca and I read the Qur'an. I was reciting, and he heard my recitation, and said, I can recite the same recitation, so I left him. Narrated by Ibn Kathir, Abu Zari al-Tabari said, I heard Abu al-Akhtas say, I gave my daughter in marriage to Al-Hussein al-Hallaj when I saw his good conduct and diligence, and after a short time it became clear to me that he is a deceitful sorcerer, a hateful infidel. Ibn Kathir also said, Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Razi said, I heard Omar ibn Uthman cursing him and saying, if I could have killed him, I would have killed him with my own hands. I said to him, what did the Sheikh get on him? He said, I read a verse of the Book of Allah and he said, I can compose like it and speak like it. Ibn Kathir also said, and Abu al-Qasim al-Qashayri mentioned in his letter in the chapter on preserving the hearts of the sheikhs, Omar bin Uthman entered the house of Al-Hallaj when he was in Mecca. Al-Hallaj was writing something on paper and Omar said to him, what is it? Al-Hallaj said, it is against the Qur'an. He said, then he prayed for him and then he was not successful. Al-Hallaj denied that Abu al-Akhtas married him to his daughter. Get ready for a captivating exploration as we unravel the layers of works and their profound significance. Al-Hallaj's principal works, all written in Arabic, included 27 riwayat stories or narratives collected by his disciples in about Kitb al-Tosan, a series of 11 short works, poems collected in Dawan al-Hal, pronouncements including those of his last night collected in Akbar al-Hal. His best-known written work is the Book of Al-Tawassin, in which he used line diagrams and symbols to help him convey mystical experiences that he could not express in words. Yosin is the broken plural of the word Sun, which spells out the letters and Sun placed for unknown reasons at the start of some surahs in the Quran. The chapters vary in length and subject. Chapter 1 is an homage to Muhammad, for example, while chapters 4 and 5 are treatments of his legendary ascent to Misra. Chapter 6 is the longest of the chapters and is devoted to a dialogue of Satan, Iblis and God, where Satan refuses to bow to Adam, although God asks him to do so. Satan's monotheistic claim that he refused to bow before any other than God even at the risk of eternal rejection and torment is combined with the lyrical language of the love-mad lover from the Manan tradition, the lover whose loyalty is so total that there is no path for him to any other than the beloved. This passage explores the issues of mystical knowledge for when it contradicts God's commands, for although Iblis was disobeying God's commands, he was following God's will. His refusal is due, others argue, to a misconceived idea of God's uniqueness and because of his refusal to abandon himself to God in love. Hallaj criticizes the staleness of his adoration mason. Al-Hallaj stated in this book, in the upcoming section, we'll be dissecting classical error views and exploring its implications in greater detail. Few figures in Islam provoked as much debate among classical commentators as Al-Hallaj. The controversy cut across doctrinal categories. In virtually every major current of juridical and theological thought, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafis, Hanbali, Maturidi, Ash'ari, and also Jafari, one finds his detractors and others who accepted his legacy completely or justified his statements with some excuse. His admirers among philosophers included Ibn Tufayl, Shawardi, and Mullah Sadra. Although the majority of early Sufi teachers condemned him, he was almost unanimously canonized by later generations of Sufis. The principal Sufi interpretation of the Shafi'at, which took the form of I am sayings, contrasted the permanence back of God with the mystical annihilation found of the individual ego, which made it possible for God to speak through the individual. Some Sufi authors claimed that such utterances were misquotations or attributed them to immaturity, madness, or intoxication, while others regarded them as authentic expressions of spiritual states, even profoundest experience of divine realities, which should not be manifested to the unworthy. Some of them, including Al-Ghazali, showed ambivalence about their apparently blasphemous nature while admiring the spiritual status of their authors. Rumi wrote, "When the pen of authority is in the hand of a traitor, unquestionably Mansour is on a gibbet." Without further ado, let's move on to the topic of modern views. The supporters of Mansour have interpreted his statement as meaning, "God has emptied me of everything but himself." According to them, Mansour never denied God's oneness and was a strict monotheist. However, he believed that the actions of man, when performed in total accordance with God's pleasure, lead to blissful unification with him. Malayalam author Vaikam Muhammad Bashir draws parallel between an Al-Hallaj and Aham Brahmasmi, the Upanishad Makhya, which means I am Brahman, the ultimate reality in Hinduism. Bashir uses this term to intend God is found within one's self. There was a belief among European historians that Al-Hallaj was secretly a Christian, until the French scholar Louis Massignon presented his legacy in the context of Islamic mysticism in his 4-volume work La Passion de Hussein ibn Mansour Hallaj. The spotlight now falls on influence as we delve deeper into its details. Hallaj highly influenced Adi ibn Musafa. Hallaj was revered in Adawiyya and later highly revered by Yazidis, who composed a few religious hymns devoted to him. Elements of his views expressed in Kitab al-Tawassin can be found in their religion. Thanks for being a part of this amazing journey. I can't wait to bring you more exciting content.